It's the final day of 10 riffs in 10 days. Let's talk a little liquid tension experiment. Dream Theater was my introduction to prog, and obviously a very important band for me, but as I was discovering their music, I also came across the first two Liquid Tension Experiment albums, and I loved them. It was that same Dream Theater vibe, but instrumental, allowing every musician to be showcased even more. There are a lot of good Liquid Tension Experiment riffs, and I could have talked about Paradigm Shift or Universal Mind, but those have been talked about a lot. I want to take a look at the intro from When the Water Breaks because it's a fascinating, crazy riff that shouldn't work as well as it does. This riff is nuts and it's all over the place from a harmonic perspective, but at its core is this motif. That's what's going to tie this whole riff together through all of the other craziness. This is being played on a 6-string in standard tuning, and this riff is rooted on the note G. This main motif is coming from G Phrygian, because you have that flat 2. This motif plays in shortened versions twice with measures of rest for keyboards before the full band kicks in, and when the riff is playing, it's alternating between measures of this main motif and other runs. This whole riff is in 4/4 except for one bar of 2/4, maybe a little unusual for John Petrucci and company, but it does make this a little easier to play. Here are the first 2 bars. This isn't too bad to play, though the fingerings are maybe a little unorthodox. Harmonically, in the second bars where it starts to go outside, I honestly think that this was purposely meant to sound outside for the sake of sounding outside. It captures the chaotic nature of a woman going into labor, which is what happened to John Petrucci's wife during the writing of this song. It's still kind of rooted around G here. The F sharp and A flat, for example, are a half step away from G, and could be looked at as chromatic neighbor tones. A big part of the angular outside sound of this is the big interval jumps. There are 2 in here that are over an octave. These 2 measures actually play again in bars 5 and 6 of the riff, and the repetition makes this a little less chaotic sounding. In measure 4 of the riff, there's a different run that trades with the main motif, and this one sucks to play. This is really outside sounding with all these intervals of a fourth, which makes for some weird fingerings on the guitar. I had to practice this quite a bit, and that brings up my picking choices for this riff. When the riff is playing eighth notes, it's slow enough that there are a lot of different picking options. I'm not fully alternate picking it, I'm doing a couple of upstrokes in a row here and there. Like right there, for example. But with the fourth measure, I had to specifically work out a picking pattern. I'm not sure if John Petrucci is alternate picking this. He might be, but I couldn't find a good live shot to confirm that. I'm economy picking on the way up, and then alternate picking the way down. It's what worked best for me, and I definitely recommend experimenting with some different picking patterns. Honestly, I didn't get this as cleanly as I would have liked, but that was the most consistent picking approach for me on this particular measure. And that brings us to the final section of the riff. In bar 7 here, it breaks away from that main motif and goes into a bunch of 16th note runs, and I am using strict alternate picking here. And this is a bunch of crazy chromatic ideas, and the chromatics have that manic, wild sound to them that's very effective to close out this riff. This one I had to memorize to be able to play properly. There's just too much jumping around to be reading the tab while playing. When I was practicing this, I broke it into 2 sections, the ascending pattern and the descending pattern. There's a rest between these, so it makes it a little easier to isolate each for practice. And then it ends with these 8th note triplets. That switch from 16th notes to triplets is weird, and it does require some practice to get used to, but I really like the sound of the triplets. It's almost like the riff is slowing down, which helps the transition into the next section, which is much slower and more melodic. This is definitely one of the harder riffs to play out of the 10 riffs I covered in this series, and one of the trickiest liquid tension experiment riffs I've learned. I'd recommend taking it one measure at a time, nice and slow, and then piecing it together. All right, that is the end of 10 riffs in 10 days. I had a lot of fun doing these. It was a ton of work, but totally worth it. If you enjoyed this series, please subscribe and hit the bell notification. That really does help me out a lot. And if you like what I'm doing here, share it with someone you know who's a fan of prog. And I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, stay proggy.